I pulled into my sister's driveway on a cool late September afternoon. The kind where the air feels still and expectant, like it is holding its breath for whatever comes next. I had driven over straight from work in downtown Milwaukee, still in my blazer, still with my laptop bag in the back seat, telling myself this visit would be simple. One day before Evelyn's wedding, one quick check-in, one last sister moment before everything in her life shifted. It was strange how hopeful I still was, even after all these years of drifting apart. I stepped inside without knocking, because that was how we used to be. Back when we were two girls clinging to each other after losing our parents in a winter accident that shattered everything. Back then, Evelyn was all I had left. I used to tell myself I was all she had left, too. Her living room was filled with garment bags, fresh flowers, and the faint smell of hairspray. Evelyn stood in front of a long mirror in her guest room, still in jeans, but wearing the bodice of her wedding gown, her hair pinned into a loose updo. She looked radiant in that effortless way she always had, the kind that made people naturally fall in line behind her. Yet when she saw me in the doorway, her shoulders tightened just a little. I moved closer, offering to help smooth the fabric where it wrinkled near her hip. It had once been natural for me to slip into the role of helper, fixer, little sister, who made everything easier. I had spent my whole life doing that for her, long after most people stopped needing help from anyone. She let me tug gently on the skirt to adjust the hem. I knelt to straighten the layers, and as I did, she looked down at me with a smile so calm and cold, it made the back of my neck prickle. She said in a bright, almost playful tone that did not match her eyes, that the greatest gift for her, the wedding, would be me disappearing from our family. For a moment, I thought I misheard her. My hands froze on the fabric. The room felt smaller, the air suddenly too thin. Behind her, Gavin stepped into view. He was 35, handsome in that perfectly groomed, athletic way, wearing a fitted button-down and the same customer service grin he gave everyone. Even now, it looked practiced, like something he kept in his pocket and clipped on whenever he needed to charm someone. He rested a hand on Evelyn's shoulder with casual ownership. He said I should not take it personally, that big life events bring out tensions and expectations, and that I often misread things. He said this as if I were a child who needed to calm down before she embarrassed herself. I rose slowly from the floor. My heart was thudding, but not hurt the way it used to. Something else was moving inside me. Something quiet and sharp. I told Evelyn I did not understand. She laughed softly under her breath, as if the question itself annoyed her, then said that I had a way of clouding her energy, that I always brought complications to events that were supposed to be joyful. She said it was her time now, her turn, to build a life that was hers alone, not one tied to old grief or obligations. Obligations. That word landed harder than her earlier jab, because I remembered another time when she said she did not want obligations. I remembered standing in a tiny condo in Racine, the condo that had belonged to our mom, the condo I had spent 2 years renovating after college with money I saved from every freelance job I could get. Evelyn had cried when I gave it to her as a gift, telling me she wanted her own space, but still wanted to feel close to family. I had been 29 then. Overworked but proud, thinking that starting fresh together was the right thing. I reminded myself of that memory as I looked at her now. She had wanted that condo so badly. She had promised to take care of it, to treat it as a stepping stone toward a better future for both of us. Then Gavin came along, and everything started shifting. I asked her quietly if she truly wanted me gone, if she truly believed I was standing in the way of her happiness. Gavin spoke before she could answer. He stepped forward just enough to block a portion of her reflection in the word mirror. He said Evelyn deserved peace on her big day, and that sometimes family members caused problems without meaning to. He said that I tended to stir things up. He even mentioned a time years ago when I suggested Evelyn take a job she hated, and he framed it like it was proof that I always complicated her life. Evelyn nodded along to every word he said. I realized then that the sister I loved was not standing in front of me anymore. Or maybe she was, but buried under layers of insecurity and influence I had never noticed, creeping in. I whispered that if she truly wanted me out of her life, she should say it herself instead of letting Gavin translate her feelings. She finally looked at me with impatience and said that if I really loved her, I would give her the one gift she asked for and step away quietly. Something in me hardened. I walked out of the room without slamming the door, without crying, without pleading. It was the first time in my life I chose silence instead of apology. As I moved down the hallway, I heard Gavin's low voice telling her he knew this would happen, that I always made things about me. Evelyn murmured something I could not hear. I stepped outside into the cool evening. The sun was sinking behind the houses, turning the street gold. I stood by my car for a long moment, letting the chill settle into my skin. I thought about how many times I had forgiven her for thoughtless words, for taking me for granted, for pushing me aside whenever someone new entered her life. Not this time. If she wanted me gone, I would give her exactly what she asked for. As I pulled away from her house, the sun slipping behind the rooftops, I felt that same hollow ache I used to feel on the nights I pretended. Everything was fine, just to keep our little family from breaking apart, and maybe that is why I remember every second of that drive home so clearly. What were you doing the last time someone made you feel small, or unwanted, or invisible in your own family? When this moment happened to me, I was gripping the steering wheel on I-94, trying to steady my breath and make sense of how a sister could slice me open with one sentence. If you are listening to this right now, I would truly love to know where you are and what you are doing, because stories like ours always seem to find people at the exact moment they need them. Back home, I kicked off my heels and sat at my dining table, still in my work clothes. My laptop was already open from that morning. A new email notification blinked on the screen. It was from my attorney, confirming the annual property record summary of the condo I had once given Evelyn. I stared at it for a full minute before clicking it open. The document listed me as the sole owner. Not joint, not transferred, not pending. Exactly as it had been years ago before I handed her the keys and told her it was hers. My chest tightened, but not with sadness, with clarity. I whispered to the empty room that if the gift I gave them was such a problem, then I would take it back in a way they would never forget. And that was the moment everything began to shift. That was the moment the revenge I never thought I was capable of started, taking shape without me even realizing it. I closed the laptop slowly, letting the weight of the realization settle, and the chapter of my old self slipped quietly behind me. I did not know then what I would do next, only that I would not stay silent anymore. I closed the laptop slowly, letting the weight of that realization settle, and for a long moment, I just sat there in my quiet dining room. The only sound, the faint hum of the refrigerator. A part of me wanted to get up and run a hot shower, wash away the whole evening, scrub off Evelyn's words until my skin burned. But another part of me, a deeper part, kept me still. It felt like something inside me was shifting, turning, revealing pieces of myself I had ignored for too many years. Maybe that is why the memories came back so quickly. They rose up like they had just been waiting for me to stop pretending. Everything was fine. I was 17 when our parents died. It was a February morning, one of those bitter Wisconsin days when the sky looks like it is pressed down, too close to the earth. I remember standing outside the emergency room at St. Luke's Hospital with numb fingers and a police officer trying to explain what had happened. I remember the way Evelyn walked in a few minutes later, snow still in her hair, and pulled me into her coat before anyone told her a thing. She was 20 then, barely an adult herself, but she said she would take care of everything. Everyone praised her for being strong, for stepping up, for keeping our family together. No one saw the other side. In private, she would look at me with this tightness around her mouth, like I was something she had been forced to carry up a hill that never stopped climbing. She never said I ruined her life, not out loud, but the message came through anyway, in all the small ways. The sighs when she had to sign my school forms, the way she tossed her keys onto the table and said she could not go out with her classmates because she had to check on me. The nights she reminded me that she had dreams too, dreams she had put aside for me. Back then, I tried so hard not to be a burden. I cooked dinners, helped clean, studied until my eyes hurt, and worked part-time at a coffee shop even though my grades were the only thing I thought might ever make her proud. I kept waiting for the moment she would look at me and see someone worth loving, not someone who needed managing. When I got accepted into a good college on a scholarship, Evelyn congratulated me in front of everyone. She told our aunts and neighbors how proud she was, how she always knew I would shine. Then, later that night, she accused me of leaving her behind, of moving on without her, of making her the one who would be all alone. She cried in a way that made me feel guilty for wanting to breathe air that was just mine. I carried that guilt for years, even after graduation. Even after getting my first job as an IT project coordinator, I kept trying to make things easier for her. She always found ways to remind me how much she had sacrificed, how much she had given up for me. And I believed her. For a long time, I believed every word. Maybe that is why I started renovating the condo Mom left behind. I found the old key tucked in a shoebox of her things when I was packing for college. It was a small place in Racine, a little outdated, but it had her handwriting on the deed. I fixed it up slowly over 2 years, ripping up carpets, painting walls on weekends, sanding cabinets until my arms shook. I wanted it to be a place where Evelyn and I could start fresh, where the pain of losing our parents could become something softer if we just lived inside those walls long enough. And for a while, it worked. When I brought her there after finishing the kitchen, she stood in the doorway looking stunned. She hugged me tight and told me no one had ever loved her like I did. I held on to that sentence like it was the last warm thing in the world. When Gavin came along a year later, everything shifted again. I barely noticed it at first. He seemed charming, attentive, the kind of man who liked being seen as a rescuer. Evelyn fell for him fast, and I was happy for her, truly. She deserved joy after everything she had carried. But somewhere along the way, she began talking about independence, about wanting a home that was solely hers. She said the condo made her feel tied down to old memories, that she needed space to grow with Gavin. I told her she should take it, make it whatever she needed, build a new life in it. At the time, it felt like the right thing to do. I was proud of giving it to her. Proud of helping her find stability, proud of believing our bond was stronger than any resentment she used to hold. It took me a long time to realize she had never given me a place in her new life with him. I was someone she thanked politely in front of others, but someone she kept at arm's length when it mattered. She would cancel plans with me because Gavin did not like certain restaurants. She would ask me to keep quiet about my promotions at work because Gavin felt insecure about his career path. She would tell me I was lucky not to have real responsibilities, even though I was leading teams, managing projects, and working overtime during system launches. Evelyn always made my accomplishments feel like something I should hide. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my eyes, trying to steady the ache behind them. Maybe that was why tonight hurt less than it should have. It was not a knife out of nowhere. It was a blade that had been pressed in slowly over years, so deep that when it finally cut through, all I felt was a strange clarity. Still, something about today had bothered me more than just her words. Something smaller, more subtle. I opened my phone and scrolled through old messages. Months ago, Evelyn used to text me pictures of wedding ideas, venues, color palettes. She had asked me whether she should choose blush roses or ivory ones. Then the messages shifted. She started asking if she could borrow money for deposits, always promising she would return it once the final payments came through. She said planning a wedding was overwhelming, that she and Gavin were juggling accounts, that it was temporary. But I remembered what happened earlier this week when I mentioned the rising cost of weddings. She went pale, shut down the conversation, said everything was handled, and she did not want to talk numbers. She'd always been a little dramatic about finances, but this felt different. This felt like someone hiding something. I stared at the ceiling. Maybe the condo was part of it. Maybe she was using it in ways she never told me about. Maybe Gavin had something to do with the nervous way she kept glancing at him, in front of me, like she was waiting for him to approve her words. I shook my head. I needed a clear mind, not spirals. I needed sleep, though I knew that was impossible tonight. Outside, the street was quiet. The kind of quiet that settles over a suburban neighborhood after 10 in the evening, where porch lights glow, and everyone else's life seems peaceful from there. Outside, my life had never felt peaceful, but tonight it felt like it was bracing for impact. I walked to the window and looked out over the yard. My reflection in the glass looked older than 33. Not tired exactly, but aware. Finally aware. Something was wrong with Evelyn. Something was wrong with the way she reacted to the mention of money. Something was wrong with the way she leaned into Gavin as if he were the one, thinking for both of them. And if there was one thing I knew after surviving the chaotic years after losing our parents, it was that trouble never arrived quietly. It always started with shadows under a door, whispers in a hallway, the sound of something cracking long before it broke. I stepped away from the window and sat back at the table, opening the email again. The condo was still legally mine. If Evelyn had been using it for something she should not, tomorrow would reveal it. I brushed my fingers over my phone, thinking about texting her, demanding answers, forcing a conversation. But I had done that too many times in the past, only to be told I was overthinking, overreacting, exaggerating. Not this time. This time I wanted truth, not reassurance. And truth has a way of showing up when you stop chasing it. I closed the laptop again, this time with purpose. The night felt heavy, and yet there was a strange steadiness in my chest. I could feel the old guilt slipping away, layer by layer, leaving space for something stronger. Tomorrow, I told myself, I would find out what Evelyn was hiding. I did not know how far the truth would reach, only that the quiet warning signs were finally too loud to ignore. I went to bed that night with my mind running in restless circles, and when morning came, I knew I was not going to get any clarity sitting alone in my house staring at unanswered questions. Evelyn's wedding rehearsal dinner was scheduled for that evening at a lakeside restaurant in Cedar Grove, and even though the thought of seeing her again made my stomach twist, I knew I needed to be there. If something was wrong, if something bigger was happening behind the scenes, I would catch a glimpse of it among the smiles and champagne toasts. Secrets always find a way of slipping out at gatherings, especially ones wrapped in celebration. All day at work, I kept getting distracted. I was supposed to finish preparing a project outline for a system update our team was deploying the following week, but my thoughts drifted constantly to Evelyn and Gavin. Every time I tried to focus, an image flashed in my mind of Evelyn's face last night. Pale and tight, the corners of her mouth drawn in like she was holding her breath. Around 2 p.m, I stepped away from my desk to refill my water bottle. As I walked past the elevator, I overheard 2 of my coworkers chatting about relationships and finances. One of them laughed and said her husband handles all their accounts, and she never sees the bills. It was meant to be a lighthearted joke, but it hit me the wrong way. I thought of Gavin at the bridal shop last month, how he hovered around Evelyn when she tried to pay for her alterations. He had nudged her hand away from her purse and told the clerk he would handle it. Evelyn laughed then, but there was no joy in it. The more I replayed recent memories, the more uneasy I became. Gavin always grabbed his phone the second it buzzed, even mid-sentence. He never left it face down on the table like most people did. He kept it in his hand, screen pointed away from everyone, especially Evelyn. She once told me he had added a complicated passcode because he traveled for work and needed extra security. At the time, it seemed normal enough, but now it felt suspicious. And there was that afternoon 3 months ago when a woman I had never seen before showed up at my office reception asking for me. She said she needed to ask a question about someone named Gavin Rhodes. I remember blinking in surprise because she looked anxious, almost frantic. But before I could even get her name, she received a phone call and hurried out. Back then, I assumed she had the wrong person, or maybe it was some bizarre misunderstanding. It did not feel like a misunderstanding now. I usually tried to keep out of Evelyn's romantic life, but as I gathered my things to leave work early and head to the rehearsal dinner, I felt an urgency I could not ignore. Something was wrong. And if Evelyn would not tell me, then I would have to look for the cracks myself. The venue sat right on the water, with large windows facing the lake. The early evening sun glowed orange over the surface. People mingled on the patio, and the waitstaff moved briskly between tables. It should have been beautiful, and maybe it was for everyone else, but my nerves made the whole place feel slightly off balance, like a painting hung crooked on a wall. I spotted Evelyn near the bar, surrounded by her bridesmaids. She was smiling, but it was the hollow kind that never touched her eyes. When she saw me, she gave the smallest nod, the kind of acknowledgement you might give a distant acquaintance, not a sister. Gavin was across the room talking loudly with 2 of his groomsmen. When he caught sight of me, He walked over with that polished grin. He asked if I was ready to take on my role tomorrow, his tone dripping with that same condescension he had used last night. I told him I knew exactly what my role was. He chuckled like I was being dramatic and said I had a habit of making simple things more complicated than they needed to be. I wanted to ask him why he always snatched his phone so quickly when it buzzed. I wanted to ask him where he had been the night Evelyn called me crying, too, weeks ago, saying she felt alone in her own relationship. I wanted to ask him who the woman at my office was and why she had known his full name. But I kept my mouth shut because Evelyn was walking toward us. She touched Gavin's elbow lightly and asked about seating arrangements. He turned toward her, his entire demeanor softening instantly, and I felt like I was watching someone slip into a costume they wore only for certain people. Dinner passed in a blur of toasts and laughter, but beneath it all, an undercurrent pulled at my attention. Evelyn avoided being near me. Whenever I approached, she excused herself to talk to someone else or check something with them. Coordinator. She kept one hand lightly resting against her lower stomach, like she was bracing herself. Halfway through the evening, while guests moved to the dessert table, I stepped into the hallway to catch my breath. The noise inside was overwhelming. I leaned against the wall and pressed my fingers to my temples, trying to fight off the pounding ache building behind my eyes. That was when I heard two bridesmaids whispering just a few feet away. They were not trying to be quiet. They were too caught up in their own conversation to notice me standing near the corner. One of them said that if Evelyn ever found out what Gavin had done to Kathy in Michigan, she would call off the wedding instantly. The other whispered that she had seen the messages months ago when Gavin left his phone on a table by accident, that Kathy had begged him to return the money he promised to invest for her. She wondered aloud if he was doing the same thing here, if maybe that explained why Evelyn always looked so stressed. My breath caught in my throat. I waited for them to continue, but a server walked by and they quickly changed the subject. When they walked back into the main dining room, I stayed frozen where I stood. Kathy. Michigan. Money. Evelyn's sudden requests to borrow from me, the woman at my office, Gavin's tight grip on their shared accounts. The pieces were not fitting together yet, but I could feel the outline of something ugly forming in the background. I pushed away from the wall and went outside, needing air. The night breeze off the lake was cool and carried the faint scent of pine from the surrounding woods. The sounds of laughter from inside drifted out behind me, but none of it felt real anymore. I walked toward the dock, stopping at the railing where tiny lights glowed along the path. My hands trembled slightly as I rested them on the wood. I felt stupid for not seeing it sooner, for trusting Gavin just because Evelyn loved him, for believing she finally found someone who would take care of her. Maybe that was the problem. Maybe neither of them had ever learned what real care looked like. Not after the mess we grew up in. I stayed out there until the coordinator announced they were wrapping up. People started filtering out toward the parking lot. Evelyn gave me a quick hug, bare more than a brush of her shoulder against mine. Gavin nodded stiffly. I did not say a word. During the drive home, the headlights of passing cars streaked across my windshield, and I felt the familiar pull of old habits telling me not to pry, not to assume the worst, not to create trouble where none might exist. But that whisper inside me, the one that had been steady ever since last night, told me the opposite. I needed answers. And not from Evelyn. She would never admit if something was wrong, not if she thought it proved she made a mistake. I pulled into my driveway, turned off the engine, and sat there, gripping the steering wheel. My porch light flickered once before settling into a steady glow. I took a deep breath and reached for my phone. There was one person I could call who did not sugarcoat things, who never cared about sparing feelings when truth mattered. I had worked with him during a messy internal investigation at my company too, years ago, and he had a reputation for uncovering things people desperately wanted to keep hidden. His name was Ethan Walden, and tonight, for the first time in my life, I was ready to uncover the whole truth, no matter how far it reached. The minute I said it out loud in my parked car, I felt something settle in my chest. It was like finally deciding to walk into a storm instead of standing on the porch, hoping the clouds would change their mind. I went inside, locked the door, and sat at the kitchen table with my phone in my hand for a long minute. Part of me was afraid he would not remember me, The rest of me was afraid that he would, and that he would confirm every dark suspicion that had been creeping into my thoughts. In the end, I dialed his number. He picked up on the third ring, his voice steady and exactly as I remembered from the investigation he handled for my company 2 years earlier. Back then, he had uncovered an internal embezzlement scheme in a matter of days. He was not loud or dramatic. He just had this careful, patient way of listening and then laying out facts like puzzle pieces. I told him my name and reminded him where we had worked together. There was a brief pause. Then he said that, of course, he remembered me, and asked what was going on. I told him I needed help with something personal, that it was delicate, and involved my sister and her fiancé. I could hear him lean back, chair creaking faintly on his end of the line, as if he were shifting into work mode. He said he could meet early the next morning, before his other appointments. We settled on a small cafe near downtown, the one on the corner with the old brick walls and too strong coffee. I barely slept. When I walked into the cafe the next day, the air smelled like roasted beans and sugar, and the soft murmur of early conversations wrapped around me. Ethan was already there at a corner table, a folder next to his coffee cup. He looked the same as I remembered, in that slightly rumpled but observant way, late 40s, with kind eyes that saw too much and kept it all filed away behind a calm expression. He stood up briefly when he saw me, then motioned for me to sit. I ordered a coffee I knew I would probably not drink and folded my hands together to keep them from shaking. He asked me to start from the beginning, and I did. I told him about Evelyn, about Gavin, about the way things had shifted in the last year. I described last night, the sentence about the greatest gift being my disappearance from the family, the nervous glances, the bridesmaids, whispering about a woman named Kathy in Michigan. I told him about the woman who had come to my office asking for Gavin by name, then vanished, before explaining why. Ethan listened without interrupting, his fingers resting lightly on the folder. When I finished, he nodded slowly and said he was glad I called. He told me that after we had worked together at the company, my name stuck in his mind because I was one of the few people who asked about the people behind the numbers, not just the damage. Then he tapped the folder. He said he had run a preliminary background check on Gavin late last night, after our call, just to see if there was anything obvious. There was. Then he had spent the early hours this morning pulling additional records. What he found made my skin go cold. He explained that Gavin had used 2 different last names in the past decade. The first was the one we knew, the one on the wedding invitations and the social media posts. The second was attached to a handful of addresses in Ohio and Michigan, along with several civil court filings. It was not enough to prove a crime by itself, but it was enough to show a pattern of hopping from place to place, leaving loose ends behind. Ethan slid a few printed pages toward me. I saw Gavin's face in a grainy image from an Ohio property records site. Same smug expression, slightly shorter hair. There was another listing from Michigan, attached to an address outside Grand Rapids. Different last name, same eyes. Ethan went on quietly. He said that in Ohio, a woman named Linda Farrow had filed a complaint against him for borrowing a large sum of money for what he called a startup investment, and then disappearing. The case was dropped when Gavin could not be located, and Linda did not have enough documentation to pursue it further. Still, the filed complaint was there, dated and signed, with details that sounded far too familiar. My stomach clenched when Ethan pointed to another section of the folder. Michigan. A man named Daniel Rhodes, who had reported Gavin for defrauding him in a supposed joint venture. Daniel claimed Gavin convinced him to hand over savings, promising high returns, then stopped answering calls and left the state. That case was logged, investigated briefly, and then closed because Daniel could not afford to keep pushing it, and Gavin had already moved on. It was like watching a pattern draw itself on paper. Wronged people, incomplete paperwork, a man who slipped away just as consequences started to surface. I asked Ethan why no one had ever stopped him. He shrugged slightly and said that financial predators often thrive in that gray areas. They stayed just under the threshold of major crime units, taking advantage of trust, shame, and the fact that many victims do not want to drag their private pain into public courtrooms. Then he turned to the last section of the folder. This one had my name on it, along with Evelyn's and Gavin's. Ethan said he had pulled a property lien search on the condo. There were no official liens in my name, which was what I had assumed, but there were some concerning documents tied to a proposed line of credit. Papers that had been started but never fully executed. He had found a draft agreement at a local bank, including that Gavin had begun paperwork to use the condo as security for a renovation loan. The interesting part was the signature block. My name was listed as owner. Then a second block, intended for a co-signer, listed Evelyn's name, not mine. Most of the form was incomplete, but Ethan said the bank's internal notes indicated that Gavin had been pushing to get Evelyn added as a responsible party for that debt, looking about how his fiancée would be taking over the property soon. I stared at the copy until the words blurred. The idea that he had even tried to leverage the condo, the place tied to our mom, the one I had given to Evelyn as a symbol of love and stability, made my hands curl into fists. I told Ethan I never authorized any of this. I never agreed to any loan, any remodel beyond the work I had already funded myself. Ethan believed me. He said the good news was that nothing had been finalized. No loan had been fully approved. No line had been officially recorded. But he also said that if Evelyn ended up on any paperwork with Gavin after they married, she could easily become responsible for debts he incurred using that property or anything else she shared with him. He looked at me carefully and spoke very clearly. If your sister marries this man and signs anything he puts in front of her, she will be on the hook for whatever he has done and whatever he plans to do. The words sat between us like a stone. I thought of Evelyn chewing her lip whenever money came up, the way she changed the subject if I asked whether she and Gavin had set a budget. I thought of her vague answers about deposits and vendors and checks that needed a few more days to clear. I thought of her asking me to loan her certain amounts, always just small enough to sound reasonable, but frequent enough to feel wrong. A sick feeling crawled up my spine. I asked Ethan if he thought Gavin had already taken money from Evelyn. Ethan said he could not be certain without access to their accounts, but based on the pattern, he would be surprised if Gavin had not at least begun to funnel her resources into his plans. That might be why she was so tense. Part of her had to know something was off, even if she did not want to face it. I leaned back and pressed my palms against my knees to steady myself. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then reached into the folder and pulled out a small, silver USB drive. He placed it gently on the table between us. He said that on that drive were digital copies of everything he had just shown me, along with some additional records he had not printed. Communication logs, public filings, bankruptcy mentions, the complaint summaries from Ohio and Michigan, and notes about a woman named Kathy who could match the one the bridesmaids had gossiped about. He told me I would need it if I wanted to stop this wedding, or at least force the truth into the open. He said it was not his place to tell me what to do with it, only that he had seen too many families destroyed because no one had the courage to push through the denial and say that something was wrong. I picked up the USB with careful fingers. It felt too light for what it contained, as if all the damage and betrayal it represented should weigh more, should press harder into my skin. For a second, I imagined walking straight from that cafe to Evelyn's house, slamming the drive down in front of her, and demanding she look at every file. I imagined her face hardening, imagined her saying, "I always chose the worst interpretation of things, that I never trusted her judgment." I imagined Gavin spinning it as an attack, as jealousy, as proof that I was the one stirring up trouble. I realized that showing Evelyn anything before the wedding might not change her mind. It might only push her further away. She had always defended the people she loved, even when they did not deserve it. It was one of her strangest qualities, fierce loyalty applied in all the wrong directions. I slipped the USB into my purse. Ethan said that whatever I decided, I needed to act quickly. If Gavin had already tried to use the condo once, he would probably try again. And once Evelyn was married to him, every piece of paper put in front of her would be 10 times more dangerous. I thanked him, paid for both our coffees before he could argue, and walked out into the morning light. The sky was a pale blue, and people were moving along the sidewalk, heading into their regular days. Dogs on leashes, parents with strollers, a man carrying a box of donuts balanced on one arm. Normal life threaded along around me, completely unaware that a few miles away, a wedding was about to become. Something else entirely. I stood on the sidewalk for a minute, the USB in my bag, Gavin's file in my hand, and a strange calm spread through me. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was not just reacting to Evelyn's choices. I was standing in front of a door, with my hand on the knob, fully aware that once I opened it, nothing would ever be the same. Then a sudden thought hit me so hard I nearly staggered. If Gavin had been willing to start loan paperwork on the condo without my knowledge, how far had he already gone behind our backs? And what exactly was he planning to walk away with once he had a ring on my sister's finger? I stood on the sidewalk with the morning light warming my back, the USB in my purse, and Gavin's file in my hand. And one thought kept circling in my mind, like a warning bell that refused to quiet. If he had already tried to leverage the condo behind our backs, what else had he done? What else was he planning to take once he married my sister? The question followed me all the way to my car. By the time I slid into the driver's seat, the weight of it pressed into my ribs so firmly that I felt almost hollow. I did not start the engine right away. I set the folder on the passenger seat and stared at it, feeling the world tilt slightly as the truth settled deeper into my bones. For years, I had believed that Evelyn needed protection from external things: stress, grief, uncertainty. I never imagined she might need protection from the very man she chose to build a life with. Traffic hummed in the distance and a few sparrows hopped along the pavement near a nearby tree. The ordinary sounds of the day felt like a strange contrast to the storm moving inside me. I forced myself to breathe slowly until the pounding in my chest finally eased. Then I started the engine and drove home with a singular, steady thought rising inside me. Enough. At home, I dropped my purse on the kitchen counter and placed the folder on the table, opening it one more time. Even though I had already seen the documents, I needed to feel the reality of them, needed to see the typed lines and signatures that proved all the doubts I had, pushed away for months. 2 different last names, complaints filed in Ohio, accusations in Michigan, draft loan documents with my sister's name printed in all capital letters, where a cosigner's signature would go. I touched the space above her name with my fingertips and felt a sharpness move through me, something between anger and grief. Evelyn had spent her whole life trying to look strong. She had chosen men who made her feel admired from the outside, but small in. Private. She had always mistaken control for care, and now she was on the edge of tying herself to someone who would drain everything she had and then disappear like smoke. I closed the folder gently. My hands were steady. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the dining table, staring at the steam rising in soft spirals. For years, I had looked at the condo as the last warm piece of our mom that Evelyn and I still shared. The hardwood floors she always wanted to refinish, the tiny balcony with the rusted railing, the place where I imagined the two of us healing in our own way. But instead of becoming a refuge, it had become the one thing Gavin could sink his claws into. Something hardened in me. Something final. I took my laptop from the counter and opened it. My attorney's email from the night before still sat at the top of my inbox. I clicked reply and typed a short message, asking him to call me immediately about a potential quick sale of the condo. I explained only that circumstances had changed and that I needed to move fast. He called within 15 minutes. He had always been efficient, but even he sounded surprised when I told him I wanted to list the condo for immediate sale. He asked if I was certain. I told him I was. I did not explain the details. Some things were too tangled and personal to unravel for anyone else. After we hung up, I walked to the living room and stared at the window blinds as the light shifted across the wall. A small part of me whispered that selling the condo was drastic. Maybe I should wait. Maybe Evelyn would finally see Gavin for who he was. But another voice, the one that had stayed quiet for too many years, spoke clearer. She had wanted me gone from her life. She had said it out loud. She had let Gavin speak for her. She had chosen him over every warning sign that flickered around them. If she did not want the gift I had given her, then I had every right to take it back before he turned it into a weapon. Against her or against me? The decision brought a strange calm with it. a stillness I had not felt since before our parents died. I walked down the hall to my bedroom and opened the closet, pull out a box of old items I had not touched in years. Inside were photographs from the renovation, a small bag of spare hardware, and a key ring with 2 shiny silver keys. I closed my hand around them and felt a quiet resolve settle into my chest. Later that afternoon, I drove to the condo for the first time in almost 2 months. The building stood in its usual quiet state, with a few tenants sitting on their balconies and someone walking a dog by the entrance. The fall air carried a crisp bite, and the breeze rustled through the last of the summer flowers planted near the walkway. When I climbed the familiar stairs and unlocked the door, the smell of fresh paint greeted me. Evelyn must have been doing small updates or perhaps prepping for something she never told me about. My footsteps echoed slightly on the hardwood floor. The place looked clean, organized, but strangely bare, as if Evelyn had begun removing pieces of herself from it. Bit by bit, I walked slowly through each room. The living room with the soft gray walls I painted myself. The kitchen with the tile backsplash I spent a full weekend installing, cutting pieces by hand and praying I would not ruin the pattern. The small bedroom that used to hold our mom's quilt. Standing there, I felt a sadness I had not expected. Not a grief for the condo itself, but for the years I'd spent trying to hold on to a version of my sister that no longer existed. I whispered into the empty air that I had done my part, that loving someone did not mean destroying yourself for them, that sometimes letting go was the only way to save what little remained. Then I got to work. I took new photographs of the rooms for the listing agent, checked the utilities, and noted a few repairs that needed quick attention. As I walked through the hallway, I felt lighter. Not happy, but certain. Certainty had a weight of its own, but it was a weight I could carry. On my way back downstairs, I ran into one of the neighbors, Mrs. Jensen, an older woman with kind eyes who had lived in the building for years. She smiled when she saw me. She said she had missed seeing me around and asked if I was moving back in. I told her I was finalizing a sale. Her face fell for a moment, and she said she used to love seeing me and Evelyn working together on weekends, that we had reminded her of her own daughters. I gave her a small smile and said life had taken us in different directions. She nodded gently, not pushing. I left the building and stood by my car, letting the breeze cool my face. On the drive home, the sun dipped low behind the rooftops, and I felt like I was moving through the final steps of a past life. That evening, after sending the photos to my attorney and confirming the listing price, I sat at the dining table again with my hands wrapped around a glass of water. Everything was in motion now. The sale, the truth, the growing fracture between me and Evelyn. And yet, one thing remained undone. One thing sat at the center of this unraveling. Gavin. I opened my purse and pulled out the USB Ethan had given me. I held it in my palm, feeling its cool surface press into my skin. It amazed me how something so small could hold the kind of wreckage that could tear through someone's life. I set it on the table in front of me, watching the final sliver of daylight slip away outside my window. The wedding was only a day away. Whatever I chose to do next would change everything. That thought stayed with me all through the night, lying awake and staring at the dim outline of the ceiling fan in my bedroom. By the time the sky began to lighten, I had already made more decisions in a few hours than I had in years with my sister. I was done waiting for Evelyn to choose me. The condo sale moved faster than I thought possible. My attorney called just after 7 in the morning with a cash offer from an investment buyer he had worked with before. The price was fair, more than fair, honestly. He sounded almost apologetic, telling me how quickly it had come through, like he expected me to hesitate. I did not. I authorized everything electronically from my kitchen table, my fingers steady as I signed each document on the screen. He told me that with a rush closing, title work could be finalized within a very short window, and that legally, once funding hit, that property would no longer be mine, which also meant it would never belong to Gavin, or to whatever scheme he had been trying to set up. When I closed my laptop, I felt something inside drop into place, a quiet click, like a lock turning. By late morning, I was on the road to Minnesota, following the line of the interstate north and then west, the landscape shifting from city edges to wide fields and clusters of trees, starting to turn orange and red. The resort Evelyn had chosen sat on the edge of a clear lake, a place she had fallen in love with during a weekend trip with Gavin. She had once sent me a picture of the dock at sunset, saying it was where she wanted to start the rest of her life. Now I was driving there, knowing that the ground under that dream was rotten. The resort came into view in the early afternoon, a wide lodge-style building with balconies facing the water. Cars filled the parking area, and clusters of guests walked toward the entrance, dressed in nice, casual clothes, some already holding small gift bags. The sky was sharp blue, the kind of beautiful day people always remember in wedding albums. I stepped out of my car and stood still for a moment, letting the sight sink in. I had thought about not coming, about staying in Wisconsin, and letting the whole thing collapse without me. But that would have been the old version of myself, the one who avoided conflict until it swallowed her whole. I adjusted the strap of my small overnight bag and walked inside. The lobby was busy. People laughed near the check-in desk. A few kids ran around the stone fireplace. And somewhere deeper in the building, I could hear music drifting from a rehearsal room. I followed the signs toward the bridal suite, my heart beating a little faster with every step. When I reached the hallway outside the suite, I could hear the high tones of excited chatter. Makeup artists, bridesmaids, Evelyn giving instructions. I paused with my hand on the door for half a second, then pushed it open. The room was bright with tall windows looking out over the lake. Garment racks lined one wall, covered in dresses and spare garments. A long table held curling irons, brushes, open compacts, lipstick tubes. Evelyn stood near the center of the room in a pale robe, hair partially done, veil pinned loosely for a trial look. For a split second, I saw her as she had been when we were little, my big sister standing in front of a mirror, trying on our mom's old costume jewelry, laughing as she twisted her hair into messy versions of adult styles. Then the present pushed in. She saw me in the reflection and stiffened. Her eyes moved over me quickly, checking my dress, my shoes, my face, trying to figure out if I was going to cause trouble. I forced myself to give a small nod. She returned it, barely, then turned away to talk to her maid of honor. No one here knew that the condo was no longer part of her future. No one knew that Gavin had tried to use it. No one knew I had sold the one thing that tied us together in a material way. One of the bridesmaids, a woman named Tessa I had met only briefly, caught my eyes from across the room. Her expression softened with a kind of pity that made my stomach tense. She walked over, holding a small makeup bag, and leaned in just enough that only I could hear her. She said quietly that she wished Evelyn had seen things more clearly sooner, that she wished my sister understood what she was walking into. I felt my throat tighten. I asked her what she meant, what things she was talking about. Her eyes darted toward Evelyn, then back to me. Her cheeks flushed. She muttered that it was not her place to say anything, and that she should not have opened her mouth at all. Then she moved away toward another bridesmaid, busying herself with arranging jewelry. The room felt smaller after that. I found an empty chair near the window and sat down, watching the reflection of the lake shimmer behind the bridal chaos. Evelyn's stylist was trying to tame a loose strand of hair that kept falling forward. Evelyn kept swatting at it impatiently, then apologizing again. Her hands would not stay still. She smoothed her veil, then adjusted it, then lifted it off altogether and set it aside. It was the kind of restless movement I had seen before, when we were younger and a bill arrived she could not pay, or a job application sat on the table, half finished. She talked fast to cover the cracks, but if you watched closely, you could see the panic simmering just under the surface. I grabbed a water bottle from the refreshments table and walked over to her, slowly. Up close, I could see the faint sheen of sweat near her hairline. Her breathing was slightly shallow, eyes too bright. I told her gently that she should drink something, that sometimes nerves could make people lightheaded, and that the day would go smoother if she stayed hydrated. I held the bottle out to her. She did not look me in the eyes. She glanced at the water and her mouth tightened. She flicked her hand in my direction, knocking my wrist just enough that a few drops spilled onto the floor. She said sharply that she did not need anything from me, and that the best way I could help was by staying out of the way. A few bridesmaids glanced over, then away. No one stepped in. I swallowed and stepped back. The sting was familiar by now, but it still cut. I bent to pick up a napkin and wiped the drops from the floor, more to have something to do with my hands than because it really needed cleaning. Part of me wanted to grab her shoulders and shake her to tell her that while she was pushing me away, the man she was about to marry was quietly lining up ways to gut her, financially. That while she was accusing me of ruining her energy, he was out there borrowing other women's savings and disappearing. Instead, I walked back to my chair and sat down, feeling the USB in my purse press against my hip like a physical reminder. We moved into the final hour before the ceremony. Guests began to arrive in earnest, and the music outside grew louder as the sound crew did their final checks. The coordinator popped in and out of the bridal suite with updates. The photographer arrived and started taking candid shots of the dresses, the bouquets, the details Evelyn had chosen with such care months ago. At one point, I stepped into the hallway to get a moment alone. My chest felt tight. The corridor was quieter, the carpet soft under my feet as I walked toward a small alcove near a back staircase that looked out onto the parking lot. As I stood there, I heard a familiar voice coming from around the corner. Gavin. It took me a second to place the tone. He was not using the charming public voice he used with guests. This was lower, sharper, his private voice. I hesitated, then moved closer, stopping just before I would be visible. I could hear him speaking on the phone. His words were low, but clear enough in the stillness of the hallway. He said that all he needed was to get through the ceremony, and then everything would belong to them. He said that once the papers were signed and accounts were merged, they could finally move forward with their plans. He chuckled softly and said that Evelyn would not question anything because she was too wrapped up in being a wife to pay attention to numbers. My stomach turned. He ended the call with a brief promise to touch base again after the reception, and then stepped back toward the main hallway. I moved quickly into the alcove, out of sight, my heart racing so hard I could hear it in my ears. Gavin walked past a moment later, whistling under his breath, his face relaxed, his suit freshly pressed. Anyone who saw him would have thought he was just a happy groom on his wedding day. When I exhaled, I realized my hands were shaking. I went back to the bridal suite and stood just inside the door, letting my eyes adjust again to the brightness and chaos. Evelyn was sitting in front of the mirror now in her full dress, veil attached correctly, lipstick reapplied. From a distance, she looked like every other bride trying to look perfect for photographs. But when I moved a little closer, I saw how rigid her shoulders were. She kept taking small, shallow breaths, lifting her hand to her chest as if adjusting an invisible necklace. The stylist reminded her to drop her shoulders. She did for a moment, then tensed up again. Her reflection in the mirror showed wide eyes, not the dreamy softness you see in magazines. No one else seemed to notice. Or, if they noticed, they chose to interpret it as normal pre-wedding jitters. Out of habit, I started to move toward her again, the words already forming on my tongue, offering a quiet moment away from everyone. A walk down the hallway, anything to give her space to breathe. But then I remembered the way she had slapped the water bottle from my hand, the dismissal in her voice. I stopped. I stood there instead, just watching her. My sister, the girl who used to crawl into bed with me during thunderstorms, the woman who had carried my guardianship papers in her purse for years as a twisted badge of honor, the person who told me that the greatest gift I could give her was to disappear. Maybe the only way to protect her now was not to comfort her, but to let the truth hit so hard that it shattered the illusion she had clung to for so long. My phone buzzed in my purse. Once. Then again. I stepped back out into the hallway before taking it out. The screen lit up with a message from Ethan. Short and precise, completely in character. He wrote that everything was ready. I stared at the words, the noise from the bridal suite muffled behind me, the distant sound of guests taking their seats outside by the lake. Ready. My thumb hovered over the screen while my heart counted down quietly to whatever was coming next. I slipped the phone back into my purse and went down the hallway toward the main ballroom where the reception would be held. The ceremony on the lawn by the lake had already finished because I had not stopped it. I had stood there through the vows, through the carefully written promises, through the moment when Evelyn said yes with tears in her eyes, and Gavin slid the ring onto her finger with a practiced smile. The whole time, the folder of truth sat like a ghost in my mind. I had not spoken then because I knew the real storm was coming inside. Not at the altar where everyone expects sentiment, but at the table set with fine linen and champagne flutes, where people let their guard down, and assume the hardest part of the day is over. Staff were already moving through the ballroom when I stepped in. Light poured in from the windows that looked out over the lake, reflecting off glassware and silverware, making everything sparkle in that soft, filtered way that looks beautiful in photographs. The tables were dressed in ivory cloths with eucalyptus runners, candles in clear holders, and small name cards at each place setting. Near the back of the room, I saw Ethan in a dark suit, blending in as if he belonged to the event team. He stood, talking to the banquet manager, his expression calm and professional. On a nearby side table sat a stack of small white envelopes, each one labeled with a table number. My throat went dry. Earlier that morning, after his message saying everything was ready, I had met him briefly in the resort parking lot while most guests were busy getting dressed. We had gone over the plan again. Copies of the documents from the USB had been trimmed down, summarized, and organized by name. Gavin's history, the complaints from Ohio and Michigan, the information on Linda Farrow, Daniel Rhodes, and the others, all put into a form that regular people could understand in a single reading. Ethan had also been quietly contacting the people Gavin had hurt. Not all of them could make it on such short notice, but a few had driven or flown in, angry and determined. Among them were Linda and Daniel. They were seated now among the other guests, blending into the crowd, their pain disguised under formal clothes. The police were there too, but not in uniform. 2 detectives Ethan had coordinated with sat near the bar, looking for all the world like relatives from out of town. Their jackets were just a little heavier, their eyes just a touch sharper. They had reviewed Ethan's files earlier and told him they needed victims on a site willing to make statements. They also needed Gavin present, with identification on him, in a place where he could not just vanish when confronted. The ballroom began to fill. People laughed and said how beautiful the ceremony had been. They complimented Evelyn's dress, the flowers, the view. A few came up to me and said polite things about how proud I must be, how happy I must feel to see my sister so radiant. I smiled and nodded when required, but inside, I felt like I was standing in the center of a fault line that was minutes away from breaking open. Evelyn and Gavin entered last as the new married couple, walking through the doorway to polite applause and a few loud whistles. Evelyn clutched her bouquet tightly, smiling too hard. Gavin had his hand possessively at the small of her back, soaking up the attention. When his eyes met mine across the room, a small, satisfied curve tugged at his mouth. He believed he had won. The coordinator signaled the staff, and servers began moving discreetly between tables, placing one white envelope at each seat. I watched as they worked, quietly efficient. To most guests, it just looked like another piece of the wedding planning, some personal note from the couple, or a favor card. No one questioned it. Ethan moved subtly to the side of the room where he could see both the head, table, and the doors. One of the undercover detectives drifted closer to the entrance. The other took a seat near Gavin's groomsmen. Dinner service started. People chatted over salads and bread, clinking forks, pouring more wine. Evelyn glanced at me once from the head table, then away. Gavin raised his glass in my direction in a gesture that might have seemed friendly to anyone else, but felt like a challenge to me. The envelope sat untouched for a few more minutes, small time bombs waiting for a spark. It came sooner than I expected. Somewhere near the middle tables, a chair scraped back loudly. A woman's voice cut through the hum of conversation, sharp with shock and fury. She shouted that the bride was about to marry a con artist. Every head turned. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. The entire ballroom held its breath. The woman standing was older, in her late 50s maybe, with auburn hair pulled back and a dark dress. I recognized her from the photograph Ethan had shown me. Linda Farrow. She held an opened envelope in one hand, the printed sheet trembling between her fingers. Her other hand pointed straight at Gavin. She said loudly that he had stolen money from her in Ohio. Her voice broke on the word stolen. She said he had promised to invest it, to help her after her divorce, to double her savings. Instead, he had disappeared, leaving her to explain to her children why their college funds were gone. Gavin froze for a split second, then tried to laugh it off, saying something about a mix-up, but the room had already shifted. Other guests, seeing Linda's reaction, began opening their own envelopes. The sound of paper tearing filled the room, a strangely soft noise under the tension. I watched their faces change, surprise first, confusion, then horror. Faces went pale, jaw muscles tightened, a few hands covered mouths. Whispers started to slide from table to table. One of Gavin's old acquaintances from Michigan, a man who had driven in that morning after Ethan contacted him, stood up next. His name tag at the table said Daniel. I knew from Ethan that his full name was Daniel Rhodes. He held his envelope contents up like evidence and glared at Gavin so hard, it felt like the air between them might spark. He called across the room that he had filed a complaint in Michigan years ago. He said Gavin had taken his savings under a fake business plan and then slipped away before any action could be taken. He said he had spent years paying off debt alone, thinking he would never see justice. The words rolled through the room in waves. Gavin began to protest. He spoke over Daniel, over Linda, his voice rising. He said they were liars, that this was an attack, that someone was trying to destroy his special day. His eyes darted around, searching for an exit point. Evelyn sat frozen at the head table, her bouquet limp in her hands. Her eyes bounced from Linda to Daniel to the papers in front of her that she had not yet opened. One of the detectives stood up slowly. He spoke in a calm, firm tone, identifying himself. He said that multiple complaints had been received and that recent evidence suggested a pattern of fraud using interpersonal relationships and false identities. He said the information in the envelopes had been shared with their department earlier that day, and that they were here to make formal statements. Gavin's face changed in an instant. The charm fell away completely. His jaw clenched, his eyes narrowed, and the veins in his neck stood out. He took one sharp step back from the head table, then another, as if putting distance between himself and the accusations might make them less real. Then he turned toward the nearest side exit. The room erupted. Some people gasped. A few shouted for him to stop. Chairs scraped as several guests stood up at once. He pushed past one of his groomsmen and made it 3 long strides before the second detective, who had been waiting by that side of the room, moved in. They met near the edge of the dance floor. The detective grabbed Gavin's arm firmly. Gavin jerked away, swearing, his voice cracking with panic. The detective did not let go. He steadied his stance, repeated that Gavin needed to stop moving, and that he was now being detained. Based on active complaints and probable cause, another staff member rushed to clear guests away from the immediate area. I stood near the back wall, watching as a life carefully constructed out of lies started to crumble in one loud, messy moment. Evelyn finally seemed to snap back into her body. She stood up so quickly that her chair tipped backward and hit the floor. The sound made several people jump. She stumbled a little in her dress, but made her way down from the head table, gripping the edge for balance. She called out to Gavin, her voice shaking, demanding that he say something. Say anything. Tell her that this was not what it looked like. He twisted in the detective's hold and shouted back that none of it was true, that these were bitter people blaming him for their own bad choices. Then his eyes landed on me. His expression shifted again, now sharp and vicious. He spat out that this was my doing. He called me crazy, said I had always been jealous, said I had set him up because I could not stand seeing my sister happy. Dozens of eyes turned toward me. The room seemed to tilt slightly, as if everyone had moved at once. For the first time in a very long time, I did not flinch under Evelyn's gaze. She turned slowly, her veil slipping slightly off to one side. I could see the exact moment her heart broke in her face. Her eyes were wet, but behind the tears, there was a kind of desperate hope, like she was still searching for any angle that might make this hurt less. She asked me in a raw voice if I knew about any of this, if I had known and kept it from her. Her words wobbled, but the accusation was there. I took a breath. The room felt full of electricity, the air thick with the scent of food no one was eating, and flowers that suddenly seemed too sweet. I told her calmly that I had only learned the full extent of it very recently. I said that the information in those envelopes came from people Gavin had already hurt, and from records he had left behind. I added that I had tried to give her a chance to see things on her own, that I had wrestled with how to protect her without ripping her world apart. My voice was steady, to my own surprise. Then I said something I had not planned word for word, but that came out with a clarity that felt like it had been forming in me for years. I reminded her that just the night before, She had told me the greatest gift I could give her wedding was to disappear from our family. I told her I had listened, that I had stepped back, that I had let her choose. And then I told her that what I really wanted was for her to see who had actually been stripping her life away piece by piece, that it was not me. Guest watched, silent, the tension pressing against the walls. The lead detective began formally reading out the preliminary charges. They were holding Gavin on words like fraud and theft and deliberate misrepresentation. He mentioned the complaints in Ohio and Michigan by name. He said Linda's name. He said Daniel's. He described a pattern of financial targeting of women and families through romantic manipulation. Every word seemed to hit Evelyn like another physical blow. Her face crumpled slowly as the man she had married less than an hour ago struggled against the officers, shouting that it was all blown out of proportion, that he would sue everyone in the room. No one believed him. Not anymore. I saw her sway once in her heels. A bridesmaid moved to steady her, but Evelyn brushed her off, eyes still fixed on Gavin as if sheer force of will might transform him back into the charming fiancé she had chosen. Then, as the detectives guided him toward the doors to take him into custody, the reality finally seemed to land. Her knees buckled. The bouquet slipped from her fingers and hit the floor, petals scattering across the polished wood. As she sagged toward the ground, the room erupted into motion. Greetings rose, chairs scraped, someone called for water, another shouted for space. I stood rooted to the spot for a heartbeat longer, watching the day my sister had clung to for years dissolve into something none of us would ever forget. The bouquet slipped from her hands and petals scattered, and then everything blurred. Someone reached Evelyn before she hit the floor, a bridesmaid and the coordinator together, trying to lower her gently. People were talking all at once. The sound of chairs scraping, a fork falling, someone knocking over a glass. The band stopped mid-song. The air felt thick and hot, even though only moments earlier it had been just another pretty reception. Room with candles and white linens and polite laughter. I remember stepping forward 1 second and then stopping the next. An old habit, that half step toward my sister and the immediate pull back. For so many years, I had rushed in when she fell, when she cried, when she called in the middle of the night. This time, my feet stayed planted. The resort staff moved with brisk professionalism, clearing a circle around her, bringing water and one of those little cold packs from the bar. A guest who happened to be a nurse checked her breathing and pulse. The detectives gave space, but stayed close enough to keep an eye on Gavin. He continued to shout about lies and setups and jealous sisters. I caught Ethan's eye from across the room. He gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. The kind you give someone when you know there are no pretty words for what just happened, but you want them to know they are not alone. Before long, Gavin was escorted out of the building. I watched through the glass doors as the officers guided him toward a waiting car in the parking area, the late afternoon light catching on the shine of his cufflinks. For the first time since I had met him, he looked less like a charming professional and more like what he was. Cornered. That night felt endless and yet strangely fast. People drifted home early, carrying their gifts back to their cars, whispering in small clusters. Some guests came up to me with wide, stunned eyes, asking if I was all right, asking what would happen to Evelyn, asking how long I had known. I gave them short, honest answers and then stepped away. Eventually, I found myself back in my hotel room, sitting on the edge of a bed that did not feel like mine, staring at a lamp that was too bright and yet not bright enough. My phone buzzed with calls and messages, unknown numbers, local numbers from Minnesota. A few from mutual friends. I let most of them go to voicemail. Sleep came in jagged pieces that night. Within a couple of days, the story had spread. Some guests had filmed parts of the scene on their phones, which I hated but understood. That meant it hit social media before official channels. Then local news outlets picked it up. The headlines never used our names, but the phrasing was dramatic enough that everyone in our circles knew exactly who they were talking about. People repeated versions of it in grocery store aisles and office break rooms. A bride whose groom was arrested at the reception. A small Midwestern town found out that a man had been running financial scams on women in other states. and almost got away with it again. I saw one news clip while I was waiting in line at the pharmacy. The television mounted near the ceiling replaying the same blurry footage on a set loop. It showed the outside of the resort, a shot of the lake, then a reporter talking about how the bride left the venue early while the groom was taken into custody for questioning. A diagram appeared on the screen illustrating cross-state fraud. Then, a legal expert discussed how romance and money often collide in quite destructive ways in this country. I stood there holding a bottle of shampoo and a box of granola bars, listening to strangers around me react. Some clucked their tongues in sympathy for the bride. Others made cynical comments about men and money. No one knew that the younger woman in the background of one of the grainy photographs, half turned away, was me. By the time I drove back to Wisconsin, the condo sale had fully closed. The final documents arrived in my email with digital signatures and confirmation from the title company. The money landed in my account in one clean transfer. It was more than I had ever seen at one time in my life, and yet it did not feel like some lottery win. It felt like a boundary given numerical form. I went back to the condo one last time with a small box in my hands. Not as an owner, but as someone who needed to pick up a few things I had left behind. The new buyers were not moving in for another week, and my attorney had arranged access for that purpose. The building looked the same, but it felt different. I walked the rooms slowly. The place was empty now, the walls bare, the echo sharper. I collected the last of my old tools from a hall closet and a framed photograph from one of the kitchen cabinets that I had forgotten. An image of me and Evelyn sanding floors side by side years ago, our hair pulled back with bandanas, dust streaking our cheeks. I held the photo for a moment and then slid it into the box. On my way out, I locked the door carefully and rested my palm against the cool wood for a second. I quietly told our mom that I had done the best I could, that I had loved this place and what it represented, but I refused to let it become a trap for us. Back at my own house, I put part of the sale money into a separate high-yield savings account and made a few practical decisions. I paid off the remainder of my car loan. I cleared the last of my student debt, a stubborn small balance I had been chipping away at for years. Then I sat with a financial advisor who explained how to protect the rest in simple, clear language. I chose safe options. I did not want to risk it. I wanted security. Work helped. Returning to my job gave me something structured to hold on to. My coworker, many of them having heard some version of the story through the local grapevine, treated me with a mix of curiosity and kindness. I appreciated the kindness and ignored the curiosity. But even with work and financial decisions occupying my days, the emotional debris did not dissolve on its own. Years of guilt and responsibility had worn grooves into my thinking, and my mind kept sliding down them. Did I wait too long? Did I blow everything up in a way that was more dramatic than necessary? Did I betray my sister, even while I was trying to save her? After one too many nights lying awake, replaying scenes, I made a phone call I had put off for too long. I looked up a therapist who specialized in family dynamics and trauma, someone a coworker had recommended quietly months earlier when I mentioned how complicated my relationship with my sister was. The first session felt strange. It's in a small office, soft chairs, framed diplomas, a basket of tissues on the side table. I told the story haltingly at first, then in more detail. The therapist listened with focused attention and did not rush me. She asked questions that did not accuse, only illuminated. We talked about the way I had been cast as the fixer since I was a teenager, about how being the one who cleaned up messes can feel like a role, but also like a cage. About the difference between helping someone and enabling them. She asked me what it felt like to be the one who pulled the pin at the reception. I told her honestly that it felt both cruel and necessary, like cutting someone free from a burning building while they screamed to stay inside. Over the next few weeks, I kept attending therapy. We explored patterns that stretched back long before Gavin, the nights after our parents died, the promises I had made without realizing I was making them, the way I had allowed Evelyn's moods to define my worth for too many years. It was not a quick fix. There were no sudden epiphanies wrapped in neat bows, but bit by bit, some of the guilt began to loosen. I started to understand that saving someone does not always look like swooping in with comfort. Sometimes it looks like stepping back while the truth does its painful work. All the while, my phone kept lighting up. Calls from Evelyn. At first, they were frequent and frantic. Sometimes she left messages. Sometimes it was just missed call after missed call. The messages ranged from angry to broken. In one, she accused me of ruining her life. In another, she asked how long I had known about Gavin. In another, she cried, saying she had nowhere to turn. I listened to a few of them. I deleted others without opening. For the first time, I did not call back immediately. I did not rush over. My therapist had suggested giving myself space before responding, reminding me that I was allowed to protect my own mental health. Saying no to immediate contact was not cruelty. It was self-preservation, so I waited. I let the calls go unanswered while I steadied myself. Through the grapevine and through a few quiet updates from Ethan, I learned more about the fallout. Gavin was facing charges, formally now. Multiple victims had stepped forward, not just Linda and Daniel. Some of the debt he had tried to saddle Evelyn with was under review. Remember that draft loan involving the condo that Ethan had uncovered? Because the property had been sold legitimately before any fraudulent documents were finalized, and because my name had never been properly attached to the new loan attempts, further investigation had flagged his actions as potentially criminal misrepresentation. The bank launched an internal review. Some related credit lines that Gavin had pushed Evelyn to sign up for were placed under dispute. It turned out that in the rush to bind her finances to his, he had cut enough corners to leave openings for lawyers and auditors. With help from a legal aid group and some patient financial counseling, Evelyn was able to get several questionable obligations suspended and eventually voided. She was not completely free of financial consequences, but she was not crushed under the mountain of debt he had planned for her either. Knowing that made it easier for me to sleep. One gray Saturday morning, about a month after the wedding disaster, I was in my kitchen making coffee and folding a small basket of laundry at the scent table. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a neighbor's leaf blower. I had just set my mug down when I heard a car door close outside. It registered in that vague way background noises do. But then there was another sound. Footsteps on the front walk. The doorbell rang. It was the middle of the day, not the time of night when you brace for bad news. Still, my chest tightened. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and walked down the hallway, each step measured. When I opened the door, she was standing there. Evelyn. No gown, no veil, no careful makeup. Just my sister on my front step, her shoulders slightly hunched, a small overnight bag at her feet, and a look on her face I could not read yet. Evelyn stood on my doorstep with a small overnight bag and a look I could not read. Her hair was pulled back in a loose knot, her face bare, and something in her posture reminded me of a much younger version of her, the one who tried so hard to be strong after our parents died. I stepped aside and told her she could come in. She hesitated, then crossed the threshold like someone entering a place they were not sure they were welcome in. We walked to the kitchen in silence. The laundry basket sat on the table, half folded. I pushed it aside and asked if she wanted coffee or water. She shook her head. She sat with both hands gripping the edge of the table, eyes fixed on the wood grain. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she breathed out shakily and told me she had rehearsed her words the entire drive, but every sentence had vanished. I sat across from her and told her she could start anywhere. She stared down at her hands as if they were unfamiliar. She said Gavin had manipulated her for months. That much I already knew. But hearing it from her felt different. She told me the small ways he chipped at her confidence, how he complimented her in public, only to pick at her in private, how he pushed her to sign things quickly, telling her she was holding them back, how he made her feel chosen one day and insufficient the next. Then she said something that made my chest tighten. She told me she knew she had hurt me too, long before Gavin arrived. She said the worst part of the wedding collapse was not the humiliation or the headlines, but the fact that when everything crumbled, the first person she wanted to call was the same person she had told to disappear from her life. Her voice cracked when the word disappeared. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She said she had treated me badly, not because I had done anything wrong, but because she was jealous. She said she always felt like she was falling behind, while I quietly built a life, paid my bills, and did not crumble. She said after our parents died, everyone praised her for taking guardianship and told her how strong she was. But at the same time, they whispered about my potential and my future. She felt she was cast as the responsible one, who gave up everything, while I got to be the one with promise. I listened without interrupting, feeling a mix of softness and old pain stirring in me. She said Gavin saw her insecurity immediately and fed it. He suggested I look down on her. He pointed out how I was financially stable and she was not. He told her I was always judging her. She said it all so quietly I had to lean forward to hear her. When she stopped talking, I told her I had felt that jealousy for years, even before I had words for it. The comments about me being too ambitious or too focused on work, the times she turned my successes into reflections of her failures. I told her that in my early 20s, I actually shrank myself to make her comfortable. I downplayed promotions, hid raises, pretended I was less stable than I was. That part made her flinch. Then I told her I had not saved her. She looked up sharply. I told her again. I said exposing Gavin and selling the condo was not about rescuing her. It was about refusing to let her hurt me anymore, to avoid facing her own pain. I said that when she told me the greatest gift I could give her wedding was to disappear from our family, something in me broke and reset. I said I acted because I finally understood that letting her sink or swim was the only path left that did not destroy me in the process. She stared at me with wet eyes and said she was terrified that I would never speak to her again. I admitted I had thought about it. I told her it would have been easier to build a life without her in it, a quiet life, without late-night calls, or the weight of her disappointment. But I also told her that the thought of having no sister at all created a hollow ache in its own way. We talked for a long time about our childhood. Nights when we curled up on the old couch listening to rain. The way she tried to sign adult papers at 20, while I studied for exams at 17. We acknowledged that we were both too young, too overwhelmed, and we both made mistakes that calcified into habits. Then I shifted the conversation to now. I told her gently but firmly that if we were going to rebuild anything, it could not be by slipping back into old patterns. I said I needed real boundaries. I would support her, but not carry her. I would listen, but not absorb the blame meant for others. I would walk beside her while she rebuilt, but not let her drag me into emotional quicksand again. She sat very still, then nodded once, slowly. She said she accepted that she had a long road ahead with lawyers and credit counselors. She said she knew she had signed things she should not have and ignored things she should have questioned. She said she was ready to stand in front of those offices and own her part of it. Her voice had a quiet strength I had not heard from her in a long time. I stood, walked to my small desk, and took out the white envelope I had prepared earlier. I placed it between us. She looked at it as if it might break. I told her it was the last envelope I wanted either of us to ever center our lives around. Inside were the final sale papers of the condo, the complete record, proof that the property was free of Gavin's interference, free of liens, free of hidden obligations. I also included a one-page letter I had written by hand. She opened the envelope and read in silence. Her breathing hitched when she reached the handwritten page. In that note, I told her she did not owe me a cent for the condo. I wrote that by selling it before Gavin touched it, I had closed the most dangerous financial trap he had set. I told her that I was using the money to stabilize my own future and that this was not up for negotiation. Then I wrote the line that mattered most. I wrote that she did not owe me guardianship anymore, and I did not owe her for survival. All debts between us were finished. When she lowered the note, her hands trembled. Her eyes lifted to mine, and she asked if I was truly sure. I told her I was, more sure than anything. Silence moved through the kitchen like a soft wind. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then she reached across the table, tentative, careful, as if expecting me to pull away. Her fingers touched the back of my hand, then curled around it with a shaky grip. Her hand was cold, but the touch was real, honest. Not desperate or manipulative. Something new. Or maybe something old, finally stripped of fear. I wrapped my fingers around hers, not tightly, just enough to let her know I felt it. And for the first time in years, I did not feel like the ground between us was about to break open again. It felt like a small, fragile bridge, one we might actually be able to build on. I sat across from Evelyn with her hand folded in mine, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt the edges of something settle instead of break. It was not forgiveness, not yet, and not some magical restoration of the past. It was quieter, steadier, like the soft click of a door finally closing with the right alignment. We sat there until her breathing evened out again. Then she let go gently, almost reluctantly, as if afraid the air between us might turn brittle again if she moved too fast. She stayed for a little while longer, long enough for a cup of water, long enough to sit without words. Before she left, she asked if she could call me in a few days. Not tomorrow, not tonight. A few days. She asked it softly, like a question she was prepared to accept not to. I told her yes. She nodded and stepped out into the fading afternoon light. When I closed the door behind her, I leaned my back against it and let out a breath I had been holding for years. 6 months slipped by in a way that surprised me. Not fast, not slow, just steady, like a tide that recedes and returns without rushing. I moved through those months with more clarity than I had expected, building something I had never really had before. My own life, chosen on my own terms. The townhouse I found sat on a quiet street in Madison, tucked between maple trees and a small park that stayed filled with kids on scooters through the warmer seasons. It was not large, not fancy, but it felt like mine in a way nothing had felt mine in a long time. Sunlight pooled across the living room in the mornings, warming the hardwood floors and making the place smell faintly of the lavender candle I kept near the window. I bought furniture slowly, choosing things that felt comfortable instead of impressive. Soft blankets, warm lamps, a kitchen table big enough for friends, but not big enough for anyone to pile their problems onto and expect me to fix them. I found a hiking group through a coworker. Every Saturday morning at 7:30, we met near the edge of a state forest, just outside town. The first morning I went, I stood beside my car listening to the chatter of strangers and almost turned around. But someone tapped my shoulder. A woman with silver hair pulled into a ponytail and asked if it was my first hike with them. When I nodded, she grinned and said they were a gentle bunch, unless someone brought a bad trail mix, so I would be safe. They became my people in a strange, organic way. People who did not know my family history, who did not look at me with old expectations, who talked about bird sightings and weather and good boots instead of the past. Work settled into its own rhythm, too. I kept seeing the therapist who had helped me untangle the deepest knots, and every session peeled away another layer of guilt I had mistaken for loyalty. I felt lighter. Not carefree, but grounded. And in the middle of all that newness, there was someone else. His name was Aaron, a colleague from a department I used to collaborate with before everything in. My personal life exploded. We met for coffee one afternoon to discuss a small project, and the conversation drifted beyond work, without either of us forcing it. He had an easy way about him, patient and quiet, but warm. When he asked if I wanted to grab dinner sometime, I heard something in myself answer yes before the old fear could say no. We kept it simple, nothing rushed. Walks, late lunches, a movie night where we both fell asleep halfway through. Something gentle, something honest. Evelyn's life changed too, not in cinematic leaps, but in steady, measured steps. She started therapy twice a week. She found a job at a small insurance office near her apartment, something stable that did not overwhelm her. She began taking evening classes on budgeting and personal finance, something she once would have been too proud to admit she needed. She never asked me for money. She never tried to shift her pain onto me. We spoke every few days, sometimes briefly, sometimes longer. The conversations were softer, more careful, but not fragile. Boundaries held like the frame of a house, rebuilt stronger than before. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of cinnamon coffee and my journal open. Outside the window, leaves the color of marigold drifted slowly down into the yard, settling over the sidewalk in a thin golden blanket. I had been writing a list of things that had changed in the past half year. A heart that no longer nodded itself every time my phone buzzed with my sister's name. My pen paused as a memory rose, uninvited but clear. Evelyn stood in her wedding dressing room, smiling with that cold edge that did not reach her eyes, telling me the greatest gift I could give her wedding was to disappear from our family. I looked at the page in front of me and felt a small, genuine smile form. I whispered to myself that I had disappeared, just not in the way she had meant. I had disappeared from the role I had played my entire life. The fixer, the emotional garbage bin, the silent buffer between her choices and their consequences. I had stepped out of a role that had been choking me for years, and stepping out of it had saved both of us. I closed the journal and leaned back in my chair. Sunlight warmed my face. For the first time in years, the silence in the house felt like peace instead of loneliness. I had thought for a long time that loving your family meant giving until it hurt. But sitting there, bathed in soft morning light, I realized something different. Family love is knowing when to step away before the hurt becomes your entire identity. Sometimes the bravest love is the kind with boundaries. I walked to the window and opened it slightly to let the autumn air drift in. A couple of kids rode their bikes down the sidewalk, laughing as their jackets flapped behind them. Life moved on, simple and ordinary and beautiful. I whispered softly that I had not disappeared from my family at all. I had disappeared from being the victim, and that was the greatest gift I had ever given myself. If you have ever been told that you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this: silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you are listening from.